Is it World Series or bust for the 2022 Mets? On today's episode of Locked On Mets, I'm going to explain why fans should set a little bit more reasonable expectations for the Mets this upcoming season.
You are Locked On Mets, your daily New York Mets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello to all you amazing Mets fans. You're listening to Locked On Mets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you for making Locked On Mets your first listen every day. Locked On Mets is free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. Now on today's show for a Throwback Thursday, what I'm going to do is look at all of the World Series winners since 2010 to try to see if any of them won overnight. Because there's this expectation right now that the Mets are World Series or bust, and that just does not happen often when you haven't had any sustained run of winning prior to that World Series winning season. So in the first segment, I'm going to dive into recent history when it comes to World Series winners. In the second segment, we're going to go through Mets history, the two championships they've won, the other World Series they went to. How does that compare to other teams that eventually won it all? And then in the last segment, I'm going to set reasonable expectations for the 2022 Mets, who shouldn't have their eyes set on winning a World Series, but simply winning the National League East. Before we get to any of that, though, I'm your host, Ryan Finkelstein. If you want to find any of my work, follow me on Twitter at FinkelsteinRyan. You can also find some of my writing about the Mets at justbaseball.com. So if we go through recent history, you can look at this last title, right? The Atlanta Braves win a World Series this year and say, wow, that team came together out of nowhere. They added Jorge Soler and Jock Peterson and Eddie Rosario, and that team just came together at the deadline and then won it all. While you could say that, you still had Ozzie Albies, you still had Freddie Freeman, you still had Max Fried, you still had a core that had been there, Dansby Swanson, and that core had won 4 NL East division titles. This was 4 in a row, okay? So to think that that team is just an overnight success, that's not exactly the case. They had a bad first half. Yes, all of those additions came together and helped the Braves get to that point, but it was still their incumbents like Austin Riley and Freddie Freeman and Dansby Swanson and Ozzie Albies and, like I said, Max Fried, all those guys contributing to make that team a World Series champion. You go to 2020, we could throw out that season, but still, it's the Dodgers that won it all. And they had won the division 8 years in a row when they won the 2020 NL West. And this year is the first time that they snapped that division streak. And they won 106 games this year, which is a franchise record, tying the mark they set in 2019. So again, a winning team wins it all. Looked like there's some static there on the camera, but hey, we'll keep it moving. 2019, Washington Nationals. Again, you'd say, hey, they kind of came together overnight, but not exactly the case. They had 7 straight winning seasons leading into 2019. The best player on that team, Max Scherzer. You had Steven Strasburg finally healthy, Anthony Rendon. That was a team that, for the most part, had been together, and they finally put it all together. But it's not like it was just out of nowhere that they found success. And they also won the division 4 times during that 7-year span. They made the playoffs 5 times. 2018, Boston Red Sox. They won the division 3 years in a row, and they finally won it all in 2018. 2017 might be the best example of a team winning overnight, and it was the Houston Astros who cheated. And even with that, they still won 84 games in 2016, 86 games in 2015, and they made the playoffs in 2015, won the wild card game, eventually lost in the ALDS to the eventual champion Kansas City Royals. Now you can say the Royals 2015, maybe they came together overnight, but they were in the World Series in 2014, and it took a incredible performance by Madison Bumgarner to seal that for the Giants. But again, it would have been the 2014 team that would have won it overnight. This was a team that won the American League 2 years in a row. I skipped over 2016, the Cubs. You could say, all right, well, they didn't have the largest sustained run of winning before winning it all, but they won 97 games in 2015 and went to the NLCS, lost to that buzzsaw that was the New York Mets. And okay, you say, all right, the New York Mets 2015, we'll get into that. That's a team that did come together overnight. We'll talk about that more in the second segment. But hey, they didn't get the job done. You go to that 2014 Giants team and try to think about what they did before that. That was their third World Series, every other even year there. So that was a dynasty, and that really answers 2012. You look at 2013, the Boston Red Sox. That is an example of winning overnight because they went from worst to first and then won it all at the same time. Boston, I mean, that's a winning franchise. And they had, prior to that last place finish, 14 winning seasons in a row. So you more throw out the losing 2012 season and just look at what the Red Sox had been for a decade and a half. And it's not that surprising that they won a World Series in 2013. And they still had some players like David Ortiz, who had been there, done that, won a World Series in 2007. You go back to 2012, as I already mentioned, that's the Giants. 2011, the St. Louis Cardinals, a winning franchise who had 4 winning seasons in a row before finally winning it all in 2011. The 2010 Giants, right? This is maybe your best example of a team that came out of nowhere, won overnight. They had not made the playoffs since 2003, but they were coming off a season where they won 88 games. The reason why I go back into history and look at all of these last World Series champions is because it is rather arrogant, regardless of the players on the roster, to look at the New York Mets and say they're World Series favorites after an offseason, to say that they should win it all. If they don't win it all, the season is a disappointment. Let's set some more reasonable expectations, because if we dive through Mets history, which I'm going to do in a minute, this has not been a winning franchise. So you can't just jump all the way to the top of the league in one season overnight and expect you're going to win a World Series. Should the Mets be trying to win a World Series in 2022? Absolutely. Would it be shocking if they won a World Series? No. But what I'm saying is to have an expectation of a World Series or bust is it's just not realistic if we look at the history of baseball. There are very few teams that are going to go from being a losing team one year, right? And then they're going to win a division, win a World Series the next year. It doesn't happen often. The Mets' first World Series, it did happen though, 1969. What do we call that team? Trying to remember the name. There's some tagline for that team. They're identified as something. Oh wait, the Miracle Mets, because it was a miracle. Going to talk about that more in just a minute. Founded in 2009, Stance Apparel represents a radical reinvention of socks, underwear, and active apparel with a sharp focus on comfort, quality, and creativity. Stance brings an atypical aesthetic alongside some of pop culture's hottest collaborations, creating the ultimate in-style form of self-expression, because everything you wear should be a direct extension of who you are and how you feel. And that is why I love my Stance apparel. When I first got some, I was just blown away by how comfortable everything was. So soft, and the designs are super cool, whether you're into Batman, Star Wars, The Office, Major League Baseball. I got my elf socks on right now for the holiday season. Stance really does give you that comfort while letting you express yourself with these incredible pop culture collaborations. But here's what's really great about Stance. They believe that the perfect fit matters more than fitting in, that those who feel good do good. Go see for yourself by registering for an account at stance.com and get 15% off your first purchase just by using the promo code locked on at checkout. Enjoy the color and comfort of a life less ordinary with Stance. All right, so let's look through Mets history and just talk about their playoff burst and what this franchise has been, right? It's a Throwback Thursday, so let's go back in time. So you go to the Miracle Mets, as I just alluded to, 1969. They go from 73 and 89 to 162 and win the World Series. Incredible. Not going to happen every day. That's why they call it a miracle. And that's why for the Mets, it's only happened one more time in the rest of the franchise's history, which was 1986. And that team built more traditionally. There was a slow climb to the culmination of the 1986 season. In 1984, they were good. 1985, they were great. They just didn't make the playoffs. Then they were unstoppable in 1986. Their next chance, to win a World Series came in 2000. And you look at that team, and again, a steady progression. They won 88 games in 1997. Then they had that same record again in 1998. They won 97 games in 1999, but lost in the NLCS to the Atlanta Braves, who were a more seasoned team, of course, having just dominated that division for so many years. They finally went to the World Series in 2000, but lost to the Yankees, a team that just won their third World Series in a row when they beat the Mets. So that experience is important. That tradition of winning is important. And so to think it would happen overnight, again, it's wonderful thinking. And the Mets are adding so much talent to the roster that maybe it happens. But to expect a World Series is setting yourself up for disappointment. Now we move forward in Mets history. 2006, a great team that I really think could have won a World Series. If they win that series against the Cardinals, I think they'll win the World Series. But they ultimately came up short. And if you go through and really compare 2006 to 1986 or those teams from the 80s, where the Mets should have been great was in 07 and 08 after they had the experience of winning the division. But the Phillies come out of nowhere. The Mets collapse 2 years in a row. And the Phillies go on a stretch where they win 5 division titles in a row from 2007 through 2011. 2015, the Mets finally win the division again, coming out of nowhere, just like we're talking about. It doesn't happen all the time. It did happen with the 2015 Mets, and there was a chance that that team could have won it all. They could have won it all. They really could have, but they didn't sustain it, and everyone gets hurt from that rotation. They do make the playoffs again in 2016, but ultimately don't amount to being a World Series champion. They lose 92 games in 2017, 85 games in 2018, 2019 they go 86 and 76, and then you have the 2020 season. You throw that out because of COVID, doesn't matter, but they were terrible that year. Then you have this season, 2021, where the Mets were on pace to win the division and then have one of the worst second halves in franchise history. Arguably the worst second half if you just compare being a first place team throughout the entire first half and then falling off a cliff in the second half. So you look at all of that, you put it all together, and who are we kidding ourselves to think that the New York Mets should win it all next season? Who are we kidding ourselves? I'm not saying it can't happen, but what I'm saying is you have to set realistic expectations if you don't want to be disappointed. And where the Mets should be setting their expectations is they should be trying to knock off the Braves in the NL East, because that is something that, for one, you're contending for as soon as opening day hits. You're trying to win the division. And then once you go out, and let's just say the Mets have an amazing year, the expectation can change. The expectation can become World Series or bust if the Mets win 105 games, smoke the Braves in the NL East, go into the playoffs, and are having home field advantage throughout the entirety of the playoffs. Now expectations World Series or bust. I can hop on board with that. But to go into the season, opening day, and just because you added Max Scherzer and Starling Marte and you got some star power, to think that if the Mets don't win a World Series this season is a disappointment, again, you're setting yourself up for failure. So when I'm looking at the New York Mets is a franchise that, as much as I want to see them win a World Series, I just want to see them be sustained winners for once. That to me is more important than a 1-year flash in the pan World Series title. To me, it is more important to see the Mets compete in the NL East every single year, because the more cracks you have at it, that's where you can realistically win it all. Because we've seen the 2006 team, the 2015 team, the 2000 team, all of these teams, they weren't able to sustain their success, and they only got one real crack at it. And when they come up short, now you're sitting on your hands for the next decade. And you don't want to see that happen again. And under this new ownership, you now have hope for that sustained success. But what I want to talk about in the next segment is setting those realistic expectations. And that realistic expectation is winning the National League East in 2022. BetOnline has you covered all season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before as the football season continues to march towards the playoffs. BetOnline remains your number one spot for all the sports action this season. Head to their new updated desktop or mobile website to sign up today and receive your 50% welcome bonus on your first deposit. just by using the promo code Locked On. From basketball, football, NHL, boxing, and UFC, right to your favorite Vegas casino games. Don't wait to take advantage of all the amazing offers available for the 2021 season. BetOnline is the fastest and easiest way to bet on all your favorite sports. Bet online, where the game starts. So I've already alluded to it throughout the show today, but when I'm looking at the 2022 Mets and trying to set realistic expectations, the expectation should be to win the National League East. It's just that simple. The Braves have won the division 4 years in a row. And you're not going to compete for a World Series every year, but you have a chance to compete for that division every year. When you get to the playoffs, there's 10 teams right now, expanded playoff field, who knows? But right now, there's 10 teams that have a realistic chance to win a World Series once they get to the dance. But you got to get there. And I'm so sick of everyone just jumping right to World Series and not realizing the marathon that has to happen first. You have to win the division or at least win a wild card. Now, since coming to the NL East in 1994, do you know how many times the Braves have won the National League East? They've won it 16 times in 28 years. You know how many times the Phillies have won it? Those 5 years in a row that I talked about earlier, 2007 through 2011. You know how many times the Nationals have won the division since the Braves came in? Well, if you go back to their time as the Expos, they won one then, four as the Nationals, so 5 times. Since the Atlanta Braves entered the NL East in 1994, the Mets have only won this division twice. And you're telling me it's championship or bust? Like, take a minute and think about the franchise you root for and the history here. This is a losing franchise. The Marlins are the only team in this division that hasn't won it since the Braves came in, and they're an expansion team, obviously. And they've won the World Series twice. If you just look at that track record since 1994, the only team that hasn't won a World Series, the Mets. The only team that has won the division less than 5 times other than the Marlins, the Mets. So when we're looking towards the future, to me, the history of the Mets is more tied to finally being a winning team that isn't the laughing stock of the National League East. And then with that, once you get to that point where you're winning NL East titles, let's just say the Mets do become the East Coast Dodgers, right? And the Dodgers had all of those cracks in the playoffs before finally getting it done in the COVID year. But still, they won the division 8 years in a row. Do you know what I would give for the Mets to win the division 8 years in a row? To me, that is better than winning one World Series and then going back to being trash for the next 6 years. The Mets win in 2022 and then have another wild card berth the next season, like we've seen in 2015, and then they lose 6 years in a row. Is that going to feel good when you come out of the 8-year window? No. What's going to feel great is winning every year. And yes, if you lose in the playoffs every single year, eventually you'll get to that point where the expectation is World Series or bust. And every time you don't meet it, it'll be extremely frustrating. But let's not put the cart before the horse here. Get to that point first. Again, I beg you to think about the franchise you root for. What kind of arrogance does it take to say that the New York Mets have to win a World Series in 2022? Forget the talent that's on the roster. You still have to shake the perpetual schmuckness that has been being a Mets fan and what this franchise has looked like for the past 2 decades. So what I'm hoping for this season, it's not for the Mets to win a World Series. Sure, that'd be great. Of course, I'm pulling for that. And when they get to the playoffs, I'll set the expectation there. But that's the first step right now for the New York Mets. Do whatever you can to get to the playoffs. But also what I would say when it comes to a championship or bust mentality, when we're talking about hiring a Buck Showalter, and I think I'm going to do manager talk tomorrow. I haven't addressed it much on the show this week. All the interviews are taking place. Buck Showalter, the last one, he'll be Friday's interview, and then I guess over the weekend, the Mets will make a decision. But when it comes to hiring Buck Showalter, everyone is talking about his resume in the playoffs. If he's going to get the Mets in the playoffs, I'm happy. Like, honestly. And when it comes to, all right, do you go all in and sign a Chris Bryant? Do you go all in and trade for Jose Ramirez or any of these moves that we've talked about over the last couple of weeks? The more I think about it, I'm like, if you're trying to have a sustained run of success, maybe you should continue to hoard all your prospects. Don't trade from them. Maybe you should continue to sign free agents to short-term deals so that in 2 or 3 years, when a Juan Soto becomes available in free agency, you have a team that has been winning and has clear books to get the next superstar in here instead of getting the former superstar in Chris Bryant that's about to get paid like a superstar, but in 3 years probably isn't a superstar anymore. To me, it goes back to sustained success. And when Steve Cohen kind of boxed himself in that 3 to 5 year window, I think that was bad for this franchise. Hopefully they get the job done. But if the Mets make the playoffs the next 3 years, it's a success to me. I don't need to see the Mets win a World Series tomorrow. Just stop being terrible every single year. Anyway, that's going to be all for today's edition of Locked On Mets. As always, thank you for listening. Make sure you follow, rate, and review wherever you get your podcast. Make sure you follow me on Twitter at Finkelstein Ryan. Follow the show at Locked On Mets. Thank you for making Locked On Mets your first listen every day. Now for your second listen, check out Locked On Bets, hosted by your boy Q and handicapping expert Lee Sterling. Get your daily picks, blowout specials, wrong team favorite picks, and Lee Sterling's lock of the day by following Locked On Bets wherever you get podcasts.